will be much more focused on one period. So, dealing with medieval theology implies taking into account the theories of science and the text interpretation. One of the main authorities in this field, Augustine of Hipona, devotes an important part of his De Doctrina Christiana to the analysis of science and of human institutions, where the practice of sign usage and interpretation play a pivotal role. This definition and classification of science would become paradigmatic for the whole medieval culture, but following a very winding road, as it will be clear in what follows. This road starts in the 9th century, where a non-Augustinian notion of sign emerges during the first debate on the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, and ends with a return to the Augustinian notion of sign, finally become common ground for every sacramental theory. Let me show the way. The debates on the Eucharist between the 9th and the 11th century are usually rightly described as focused on the notion of the real presence and on the role played by the consecration formula in transforming the substance of bread and wine in Christ's body and blood. These debates see the opposition between, on one side, the theologians in favor of this position, like Pascalius, Barbertus, and Lanfranc of Beck, and on the other side, those against it, like Athanus of Corbie and Berengar of Tours. What lies behind this antagonism, as I would like to show, is the opposition between a non-Augustinian or non-traditional notion of sign and an Augustinian or traditional one. In order to let it emerge, we have to go back to some texts issued during the first discussion, the one between Pascalius Albertus and Ratranus of Corbie in the first half of the 9th century. Pascalius, the first debate, so it's here, the leading characters. Pascalius, before becoming abbot of the monastery of Corbie in northern France, writes a treatise on the body and blood of our Lord, around the years 831-33, where he held that the mystic sacrament, this is for showing you that it has a manuscript tradition. This is a 12th century manuscript. The mystic sacrament is rightly both truth and figure. This is text number 1 on the handout that you have. So that what is externally perceived is a figure or a mark of the truth, but the truth is what is of this mystery is rightly understood and or inwardly believed. As a matter of fact, not every figure is shadow or falsity. As one can see from this passage, the notion of figura plays a crucial role. I'm not completely satisfied with the translation of figura with figure, but, because it completely misses the polysemy of the term, but we'll be back soon on this point. Pascalius thus rejects a purely negative notion of figura, figure, meaning umbra or falsitas, as opposed to veritas, and offers an interpretation of the term as equivalent to character, which is a keystone in his endeavor, not fully understood by its contemporary and modern readers. His opponent, a monk of the same abbey of Corbie, Ratranus, in his reply to Pascalius' text, defines again the meaning of both terms. This is a copy from the same library of Heidelberg. And you can find them all free on the internet, so it's very nice. In his reply, defines again the meanings of both terms, veritas and figura, and tries to show that their opposition is unbridgeable. And in particular, that the body and blood of Christ, that in church the mouth of the faithful receive, is realized through a mystery in mysterio, namely figuratively, As well as in the Gospel of John, Jesus says figuratively that he is the vine and the apostles are the fruits. All these examples, Randall says, express one thing and suggests something else. He sees the same semiotic device at work in the rite of Eucharistic consecration as in these passages. No physical transformation can take place since the words used in the formula have to be taken figuratively. Bread and wine remain the same after their consecration, but together with their names, they acquire a new spiritual meaning. Neither Randall's nor modern scholars fully realized the value of Pascasius' equation between figura and character. Brian Starr, for instance, commenting on Radbert's i.e. Pascasius' position, says, there was, to Radbert's mind, no incompatibility between the two, i.e. veritas and figura. The Eucharist was the sacramental body and blood of Christ in veritate, no matter what else it signified in figura. The link between experience and reality was provided by the Word, the affirmation of reality, or more precisely, by the Word as authenticating text. Since Radbert accepted the Gospels as a simple transcriptions of God's verbal intentions and commands. The distinction between veritas and figura was nothing more than that between the original word and our text and subsequent commentary. Frankly, I don't really catch the relevance of such a remark, but especially if we consider that its foundation is exactly the equation between figura and character proposed by Pascasius. But let's go back to Pascasius' text. In chapter 4 of his treatise, Pascasius argues that incarnation, conception, and virgin birth are the premises which allow us to conclude that Christ's flesh and blood in the Eucharist are created from the substances of bread and wine. It's a miracle. It's a miracle. The interpretation of the words of Scripture, as several passages from the Gospel of John show, is literal and appears to preclude any figurative reading. However, in Pascasius' eyes, a difficulty arises from the fact that the sacrament of the Eucharist is a mystical rite, and therefore it implies at least two levels of meaning. The words of the rite do not just mean things, but according to the model of figurative speech proposed by Augustine, these in turn refer to other things, or in other terms, they are figures of something else. Pascasius wonders how the sacrament can be both truth and figure, since, test number 5, each figure is the figure of something and it always refers to it as a real thing. As an example, he cites the events of the Old Testament, which are both figures and shadows of the events told in the New Testament. Here, the term shadow has a negative connotation, implying a degree of falsity as compared to the full truth of the words and events told in the Gospels. As Pascasius says, the actions that take place during the Eucharistic rite, as well as the things, bread and wine, used in that context, are figures. The sacrament will then be a truth as it transforms bread and wine into real flesh and real blood. But it is also a figure, since the priest acts in the role of Christ, reciting the words of the Last Supper in memory of his passion. How does it happen then that these two modes of signification, truth and figure, that always implies in its typological sense a certain degree of falsity, become compatible in the sacrament? At this point, Pascasius plays the card of the character, or character without age, as he writes. His claim is precisely that the sacrament can be said both truth and figure, its premise being the fact that not every figure implies shadow or falsity. As Pascasius recalls, Paul, writing to the Hebrew about the twofold nature of the Son, human and divine, at the same time, refers to him as a figure of the substance of the Father, according to the Vulgate of St. Jerome, or as the character of the Father. Character is the original Greek word, according to another translation that was still circulating in the 9th century. The relationship between the two natures, human and divine, and the Son, or between the Father and the Son in the Trinity, can therefore be described in terms of the relationship between a character, the title sign, and its meaning. To explain in what sense the figure or mark should be understood, Pascasius appealed to a semiotic. Number 6. As through the characters or figures of the letters, we, as children, first come gradually to reading, then to the spiritual understanding of the scriptures, so from Christ's humanity one grasps the divinity of the Father, thus the Son is rightly said figure or character of this substance. The figures of the letters are therefore nothing else but the alphabetic marks, whose learning allows us to read the scriptures or come to grasp their multiple meanings. The modern commentators who focus on this step, such as Brian Starr, have been led astray by the singular and could grasp neither the technicalities involved in the terminology used here by Pascasius, nor the intertextual articulation that it hides. Pascasius continues the quoted text, pondering, and I leave the Latin text untranslated by now. Quid enim aliud sunt figurae literarum caracteres earundem, quam ut pereas vis et potestas ac spiritus prolatione oculis demonstratum. I have translated later. Celia Chazelle, in an article of 1992, for example, translates into English the term litere in the expression figurae literarum as spoken letters or words, missing completely the point, in my opinion. Actually, we have to read the passage from another work by Pascasius in order to get a better understanding of what he's talking about. In his commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, in fact, the monk focuses on a passage in which Jesus says, a wicked and adulterous generation looks for a sign, but none will be given except the sign of Jonah. And he comments by proposing a definition of sign as that through which something unknown, hidden, or future is meant. Therefore, correctly, Christ's passion is called the sign of Jonah, not because it anticipates or prefigures something else, but because it is the fulfillment of the sign of Jonah, i.e., its meaning. According to its Christian interpretation, the story of Jonah at Jonah's time announced the passion of Christ, but in the mouth of Jesus, the expression sign of Jonah meant nothing else but the fulfillment of that prophecy. This particular sense of sign, in which signifier and signified are the same, or almost the same, as Pascasius underlines, is not a scriptural oddity, but finds an exact parallel in the field of grammar of this time. This species of sign, he says, is quite famous among grammarians, so that it is called sign, something that doesn't mean anything beyond itself, but presents in itself the form of the sign that once was anticipated. Character is precisely a technical term of 9th century grammar and consists in the drawing of a letter of the alphabet on parchment or wax, what we would now call a grapheme, as explained, for instance, by a grammarian, Sedulius Scotus, in 9th century grammarian. While litera denotes, in its narrower sense, the smallest part of the articulate voice, what we would call now a phoneme. A character, therefore, is not a word, as Celia Chazelle proposed. It is rather the written sign of an element of the second articulation of language, the sign of an elementary box. Pascasius, using the term character, has not in mind the relationship between impression and impressor, which lies probably behind Paul's use of the term, nor that between word and meaning, but rather that between grapheme and phoneme, the minimal units of the expression, planes, or written and spoken language. Interpreting it in his own way, consideration of the grammarians who commented on Donatus or Crispin at this time, Pascasius indicates in alphabetical characters, because of their relationship with the corresponding sounds, a special type of sign, different from the traditional one and Augustinian one, that refers to something else, namely to something abstract or ontologically distinct from the sign itself. The aliud, which comes in cogitazione, notwithstanding Augustine's definition of sign. Figura, spiritus, and potestas, sometimes also called vis potestas, were considered by medieval grammarians as the basic properties of the littera. We might respectively translate them as graphic type, figura, aspiration, spiritus, and value, vocalic, consonantal, or semi-vocalic, potestas of this. Taking this into account, the above-quoted Latin text becomes more comprehensible, and I propose to translate it as follows in the second. What else are the figures first of letters than their characters, so that through them their value and aspiration, which are manifested in pronunciation, are set before the eyes. The figures of letters, namely their graphic shapes or characters, make visible what are the aspiration and the value, namely there being vowels or consonants, of the signified elements of spoken language. In short, Pascasius ascribed to the grammarians the idea that between alphabetic letters and the minimal sounds of the language, there's a one-to-one relationship. The reference to the grammarians is also present in a letter that Pascasius wrote later on, around 856, to a younger colleague, and highlights his interpretation of the grammatical theory of the littera. In him, the son, his character, nothing is fictional, nothing is devoid of truth, as well as we do not say that the marks or figures of the letters are devoid of their value as content, consonant or vowels, since metaphorically we can call letters these figures. In grammatical use, littera was used both for the character, written character, and the voice, the elements. This relationship is so tight as to make almost disappear their mutual distinction, similarly to what happens between Father and Son in the Trinity, or between human and divine natures in Christ. In all these cases of sign, the unity between the two items is so close as almost to cancel the distinction between signifier and signified. In all these cases, we might talk about quasi-identity between signifier and signified. That leads Pascasius' semiotics far beyond the Augustinian one, to which substantially adheres, as has been said, Latinus in his criticism. The reactions to Pascasius' position in the second debate are, I might skip some of the quotations, because no one could really understand this technical meaning of figura, which gives us the impression that he was a little bit playing with words, because figura, in the sense used in biblical hermeneutic, was something completely different, and that was umbra and facitas, not the second one. Figura in the second sense is something completely different. So, Ryujina, for instance, didn't really catch what was at stake there. But in the second debate, so I skipped that. In the second debate, there was something very important for the history of semiotics, I would say, and also the consciousness that this kind of sign was something different from what we have usually. Bernard Tours, in a letter to a friend and colleague at the Manus of Liège, before 1059, argues against the thesis of Pascasius, according to whom, after the consecration, bread and wine do not keep their substance, but turn into the historical body of Christ and his blood, which are present but hidden beneath the visible accidents of bread and wine. Christ's body and blood, according to him, are then subject to division, chewing, and swallowing. Bernagar disagrees with these claims and argues his position on physical, linguistic, and semiotic grounds, and I skip all of them to go to the fact that the semiotic argument is focused on the explicit resumption of the Augustinian definition of sign, and of Ravanus's position that Christ's body and blood is present in figura and not in veritate, namely that the sacrament is a sign, an image, a similitude of Christ, who's not physically present but spiritually attainable by every believer through that sign. Bernagar compares Eucharist to baptism and argues that, as in the first case, the water doesn't turn into anything substantially different, but becomes a sign of Christ's death. That is, it takes on a spiritual meaning. So in the Eucharist, bread and wine are not substantially transformed, but only converted into signs, acquiring a relation to Christ's body and blood. In support of this argument, Bernagar collects a dossier of Augustinian quotations, including the definition of sign given by Augustine in the Doctrina Christiana, and as pointed out by Irene in this definition, according to Bernagar, every word is important. The sensible nature of the sign, she says, the idea that from what it is, something else is produced, this implies that the sign cannot be the body of Christ. And finally, that all this is accomplished for the mind in cogitazione. Bernagar comments as follows Augustine's definition of sign. He doesn't say, Augustine, a sign is a thing which, over and above the impression it makes, is number 15. On the senses as a consequence of itself causes something else to come into your hand, your mouth, your teeth, or your stomach, but into your mind. The body of Christ is not a sacrament, but rather the res sacramenti, his invisible being, intellectually or spiritual attainable. Bernagar also emphasizes the relational nature of the sign, sacrament. It has a sensitive pole, i.e. bread and wine, which exist as such after their consecration and are essentially distinct from their meaning, namely Christ's body and blood. In his reply to Lanfranc of Beck, he highlights the ontological distinction between sign and signify. These terms, namely those used by the authors to talk about the sacrament, fall under the category of relation, and no related thing, the term of a relation, can be identical to its correlate. If Latranus and John Eriugena, etc., were not fully aware of the semiotic novelty of Arcadius' position, both the Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida and Lanfranc of Beck, the major sponsors of Bernagar's condemnation, show a higher degree of awareness, together with Peter the Venerable in the 12th century. So I skip some other quotation by Humbert of Silva Candida and go to almost the end of it, because what does Lanfranc of Beck is to change the kind of sign that is the sacrament of the Eucharist. Is well aware that this is a particular sign where something is really sign of itself. In the text number 21, he says, the flesh and the blood that we assume every day to ask for divine mercy upon our sins are called Christ's body and blood, not only because they are identical in essence, different, however, in their qualities, but also following the way we used to call what signifies with the same name or what is signified. Nobody will be surprised if the same flesh and the same blood are a sacrament of themselves, taken in a different way. It is exactly at this level that the identity between sign and signified things suggested by Pascalius emerges. Sacrament no longer consists in the consecrated bread and wine, as it holds instead for Berengar, but rather in what they hide under the appearances of bread and wine. When Berengar, next to the word stigium, lists other terms used by the fathers to speak about the sacraments, such as species, figura, similitude, and mysterium, arguing that these words are relative terms, Lanfranc has no philosophical point to reply, but prefers to contextualize these terms. If in other passages of his work, Lanfranc has opposed Berengar's appeal to human reason in order to understand divine mysteries, in this case he holds that the scriptures or the autores made use of those terms to emphasize different features of the sacrament. Thus, the term species, figura, and similitude sometimes refer to bread and wine for consecrations. Sometimes they are used with the meaning of truth. Sometimes the term signum, mysterium, or sacramentum are used to indicate the passion of Christ. Lanfranc's position on Augustine's definition of sign appears to be much clearer now. For him, it is a non-problematic and necessary complement to the definition of sacrament. However, since Lanfranc seems to be well aware of the value ascribed to this definition by Berengar and of the semiotic implications of Pascalius' theory, he intervenes at the level of what is signified. He turns into signs the Eucharist body and blood, which are obviously identical to Christ's historical body, to his resurrected body, and to the body raised in heaven. The effect is that of completely neutralizing Berengar's interpretation, together with minimizing any possible conflict between Augustine's definition of sign and Pascalius' interpretation of the Eucharist. Lanfranc's strategy would be very effective and would have, particularly in Peter Lombard, some decisive theoretical development, as I'm going to show by way of conclusion. In the first half of the 12th century, the Augustinian dossier, thanks to its adoption by Ivo of Chartres and Abelard's Sixth Known, is constantly included in the sections of theology or canon law works devoted to the Eucharist. Following Lanfranc, however, a neutral interpretation of the definition of sign is taken for granted by the majority of the theologians so as to prevent every possible use in an anti-realistic function. Particularly important is the quotation of Augustine's definition and classification of sign by Peter Lombard at the very beginning of his fourth book of sentences, that was to become in the 13th century the standard textbook for teaching theology at the Studia of the Mendicant Orders or at the University in both Paris and Oxford. Although he derives the distinction between sacramentum and res sacramentis from his sources, such as the Summa Sententiarum, Peter Lombard proposes a formulation of the distinction that is very interesting from my point of view. The species as a sacramentum tantum is the Augustinian sign that makes us think of something else. The rest is twofold. One is the body and the blood of Christ, this text number 22, that is contained and signified, contenta et significata. The other is the unity of the Church in Christ, its head, that is signified but not contained. The idea of content that emerges in this context and its association to meaning seems to clarify and in some way to complete the process begun by Radbertus. With this reflection on the relationship between graphemes and phonemes, also suggesting a research path from Peter Lombard leads to contemporary semiotics and to its commonly adopted notion of content. In conclusion, from the standpoint of the history of semiotics, the role played by Berengar is crucial in explicitly introducing into the debate on sacraments the Augustinian definition of sign and in obliging all his opponents to discuss it in order to give a sound theory of sacraments. Thus, we are led to acknowledge, together with St. Paul, that it was necessary to have some heretics after all. Thank you.
Thank you. And as always, we'll take the questions at the end of the I welcome Paul Tesh, who is going to present a paper entitled How is a Religious Sign composed? We can choose the
Yeah, thanks. So first of all, I would like to thank Jennifer and Robert for organizing this very inspiring conference. Secondly, I would like to deal with the following question during the next 25 minutes, namely, how is a religious sign composed? I start with the end of my talk by following Naomi's explanations on the Nachdenklichkeit. By citing Derrida, being primordial must be thought on the basis of the chase and not the reverse. This proto-writing is at work at the origin of sense. And I would like to recall that semiotic reconstruction is a detective investigation. It chases back the antecedent crime, as we know from Sherlock Holmes and Burns, and as a tribute to echo William of Baskerville. The end of my talk consists of some more or less axiomatic conclusions, namely, religion as a social cultural issue is not a substantial entity, as we all know, but a result of attribution, as N. Chase has stressed in her 2009 book on religious experience. The same holds true for elements of religion that describe each other with religious meaning. Thus, religion as a social cultural issue is an act of communication, as has suggested in his book on religion as communication. And communication consists of the activation of a chain of signs. It is the social performance of semiosis, its pragmatic aspect. Thus, communication is to be distinguished from, but related to, perceptual, mental, organic, and physical processes. That means action as ascription to actors, maybe human beings or other entities, and experience as schematized perception are special cases of communication. In general, we are able to distinguish between erleben and erfahren. Erleben would be the psychic perception, and experience the schematized perception, and social culturally constructed. Respectively, psychic perception as well as organic bodies and physical objects are never directly given, but belong to the environment of social cultural communication, and certainly have to be and are addressed by semiosis. This approach is based on evolutionary insights on differentiation between evolutionary strata. Evolution consists of the increasing complexity that emerges through differentiation between physical, chemical, organic, societal, cultural, and psychic mental processes. There is an interdependency between those strata, but there is also an interruption, a complexity interruption between those strata. And like organic processes, societal processes internally differentiate into distinguished societal spheres like law, politics, economics, medicine, and among them also religion. That means, at least from a sociologically informed perspective, that religion as a societal system of meaning has sense perception and physical matter as its environment. The Ding an sich, as we know from and since Kant earlier, is ineffable. The same holds true for psychic processes. And the interfaces are, I think, mediate between religion on the one hand and its environment on the other. Now the question is, how does religion make sense of senses? Following, I would like to refer to a paragraph of a text by the Mediation of Magdeburg around 1207 to 1282. A paragraph from her book das fließende Licht der Gottheit, the flowing light of the Godhead, Gottheit, we talked about it, as an example of the communication of an out-of-body experience. And this example shows what we discussed yesterday, namely shows how religion can take you or us or whomever to somewhere else. The text goes as follows. It's entitled, How the Soul Teaches God's Freedom in Made Things. Lord, my feet are stained with the blood of your true act of release or redemption. My feathers have been smoothed by your noble calling, my mouth has been formed by your Holy Spirit, my eyes transfigured by your fiery light, my head is made sleek by your faithful protection, my movement is delightful because of your generous gift, my flight is made swift by your restless desire, my earthly sinking is because of your union with my body. The more you grant me release, the longer I may hover in you. On the left you see the Middle High German version, the original Low High German is lost. Before I go into detail in 10-15 minutes, I shortly come to the question of how a sign can be modeled. With regard to the first and threefold sign concept, the sign usually is modeled in the shape of a triangle, as you can see here, with the representation as the sign of the vehicle. The object the sign refers to is not the object itself, but the dynamic object the sign refers to, and the interpretant that interprets the relation between the representation and the sign object. And as you probably know, Peirce coined this neologism of interpretant to avoid the misunderstanding that only human beings and brains can interpret, but signs interpret signs. And you see the relations. There is much research on how the all 6 relations between the 3 signs in both directions are to be understood. All in all, it's important to realize that none of the relations are to be seen separately, but all are in a constantly process of interaction. However, some semioticians, like Mary Floyd and others, oppose to the depiction in the shape of a triangle because of the danger to separate the relation of the sign elements from each other. They instead suggest the shape of a Y with the 3 aspects on and the sign in the center. So they argue this modeling avoids the danger of separating the relations. I think both models are right if you combine them in a what I would call a second-order semiotics, which shows a complete sign with an observing shape on the one hand and observed content. The German semiotician Elisabeth Walter speaks of a molecular sign which is composed of elements as an analogy to biology. And it's like a picture. The sign works like a picture. In a picture, we see something in something, and something as something. And I guess that in the second-order semiotics, all the 3 ways of seeing as metaphor and signification is included. And thus, infinite semiosis consists of the permanent oscillation between the observing shape on the one hand and the observed content on the other. And due to connections, the observing shape, which observes the content, becomes the observed content in another connection, and so on and so on. Now back to the empirical case. I only, due to time restrictions, I only refer to the last phrase, namely my earthly sinking is because of your union with my body. The more you grant me release, the longer I may hover in you. But the difficulty lies in the challenge to mediate the model with natural language. All linguists have similar problems. How to model language in a formalized way. There are, artificial languages to deal with natural language. However, I think there must be some mechanisms in the natural language, otherwise it couldn't work. Now, here's my suggestion that I would like to discuss with you. The phrase starts, the phrase in question starts with my earthly thinking, and it has to start at the position of the representation, because every semiosis has to extend the representation, as Massimo in various articles rightly argues. And it goes then to the interpretant, your union with my body. It's only very rough, and we would have to analyze those parts, my earthly thinking, also in the triadic manner. So it's a very, for time restriction, it's a very rough analysis. And in the end of this first process, the first move, the union as a concept, the union of God and Mesh's body as a concept, interprets the experience of the earthly thinking. Notably, the representation consists of experience, which we usually usually consider as the most subjective dimension of reality. However, as First argues that the representation reveals the most abstract content, namely quality and properties. In this example, qualities and properties of space and gravity. It would there would be much to say, and it would be probably more interesting to discuss the erotical connotations in this phrase of the union between God and nature's body. However, I concentrate on space and gravity. The phrase continues with the more you grant me release. And now we know from Peirce that the object, which was somehow open in the first process, cannot be addressed directly. So the semiosis takes a tricky way by mirroring the emerging triangle by another triangle. So you, the concept of God, interprets release, which is the representation of a new single triangle above the first emerging triangle. By mirroring the first emerging triangle, or it's more an anticipation, as we know from systems theory, there is no one-to-one adaptation of systems to its environment, but the success of systems lies in proper anticipation. And anticipation is an adaptive, trial. One never knows how evolution works out. The object that never can be addressed directly can be signified by mirroring the first emerging triad by a second triad above. As you probably know, Umberto Eco and others have stressed the semiotic importance of the mirror. And all reflexivity refers to mirroring somehow. Finally, the basic semiotic system closes with the longer I may hover in you. So in this, I would argue, elementary model of semiosis. So in analogy to biology, I would say this is like a cell works. The molecular sign is the elementary semiotic system consisting of the observing shape and the observed content, and it's a double combination of experience, cognition with concepts, and medium. The medium, which stands at the position of the signified object, semantically filled with release and I. The medium is at the position of the sign object because it mediates between the inside and the outside of the semiotic system. And the same holds true with the semantic filling. It's the earthly thinking of Mechtet, but God is by the union in her body and at the same time God is outside and is the creator of the medium of release, and I is the lyrical I on the one hand, and at the same time the medium of the experience of thinking and pondering. So my argument would be to find correspondences between structural modeling on the one hand, the syntax of semiotics, and semantic fillings on the other hand. Now, how can we understand this phrase as a religious semiotic system that consists of religious sign components? We might get into the direction of an answer if we formalize the phrase, so to speak, under the surface of concrete semantics, not to skip semantics, but to go under the surface, to go to the syntax of semiosis, which regulates semantics and pragmatics. I would argue that a system distinguishes itself from its environment by the following distinctions: self-referentiality and external referentiality. I take this from Kybernetics of second order as applied by the German sociologist and systems theoretician Niklas Luhmann. Self-referentiality and external referentiality, as well as closing and opening. There is a huge discussion in system theory whether systems are closed or open. They have to be both. They have to close and open, close and open. Like metabolism in cell protein production. It's a constant closing and opening process. And a religious sign, the characteristics of a religious sign, in contrast to other signs, consist of the distinction between, I would argue, intendency, immanence, and transcendence. And we have many other semantic possibilities how to fill this modality. It's a modality distinction. It's a mode-orientated theoretical distinction. Don't misunderstand in the medieval Christian sense, and don't fill it semantically too soon. It may be above, but it may be also, as Mechtel shows, in her and in our body. So in tendency, I would argue, the characteristics of the religious sign process is the distinction between immanence and transcendence, as well as of its unity. If there would be a unity, religion could proceed. It's a basic paradox to distinguish between the known and the unknown, the immanent and the transcendent, and its unity. Now, if we apply these distinctions to the phrase in question, we get the following result. It starts with my earthly thinking as at the position of self-referential immanence, and then it closes to your union with my body at the position of self-referential transcendence. Every religious semiosis has to start with itself. It's an autobiotic process. The ground for religion is only religion. In everyday language spoken, it only works if you believe in it. So this is the autopoietic, the self-referential starting point of religious semiosis. It's self-referential, the self-referential distinction between immanence and transcendence, and the semantic filling is my earthly thinking. This is a normal experience, I guess we all have after lunch or at night, or whatever. The Mechtel has it. And the interpretant for this earthly thinking is your union with my body. There might be other explanations, simply, having eaten too much, or gravity, Newton's, explanation. So, and among many, one explanation in religious terms is God's union with Mechtel's body. However, then the semiotic system opens into the direction of external referentiality, namely the interpretive external referential transcendence, it's you, God, which interprets the external referential unity of transcendence and immanence and its release. And analogically speaking, the emerging system gets its energy out of its environment by extending and folding in parts of its environment, making sense of the senses. Finally, the religious semiotic system closes via external referential immanence. It's semantically filled by I, because it's the medium of Mechter's experience, it's not the lyrical I, and it closes into the direction of the self-referential unity of transcendence and immanence. The representamen, by the way, the sign class of the representamen, as we know, is the icon, which stands for itself. The representamen of the observant shape is hovering in you, which observes the other experience, namely the earthly sinking. And again, I has a double meaning. It's the lyrical I, and at the same time the object of experience. That's why it stands at the position of external referential immanence. As a result, we get an autopoietic recursive semiotic system. It starts from its final closing, namely the second representamen, hovering in you, and leads via my earthly sinking to your union with my body, to via the center of the semiotic system to release, and then via you, I, and back to hovering in you again. I discussed this model with colleagues in theoretical biology, and we, interestingly, I think, found structural analogies with modeling metabolism. Getting energy from outside, transforming it, informing it for the cell production, and giving it out again. I don't know, I'm not an expert in this. It might open up new perspective for biosemiotics in terms of structure and process. And that means in terms of the syntax and pragmatics of biological processes. We already discussed a little bit of the keywords dropped: transduction, transfiguration, metamorphosis, and it somehow correlates with biological metabolism. And as Naomi's and Patrick's paper showed, metaphor, tropical, in German, I don't know, uneigentliche Rede. That means non-literal, it's literal. Metaphors, metonymy, we know it since Jacobson's crucial article on metaphor and metonymy. They are at work here in the basic semiotic system. My argument would be like the DNA has the everything in it structurally, which needs any organism, and the same holds true with the basic semiotic process in the second order semiotics, which has everything in it, has the communicative triads of utterance, information, and understanding in it. It has the linguistic distinction between semantics, syntax, and pragmatics in it. So everything we need for socio-cultural communication. And before you think I am totally insane, nevertheless might, I would like to conclude with a hint at the difference between the model and reality. The model is one thing, and reality another. Thank you for your patience.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this second talk, and we can now proceed with Jensen's talk, Science of the Unseen, Normative Cognition and Making Social World.
Like thinking. Yeah, thinking or sinking. Thank you very much, Massimo and Robert, for inviting me to this event. I've been looking forward to meeting you all here. And I would like to present some thoughts on some ongoing research. Some of it may seem extremely trivial, but that's because it refers to something that we all do all the time. And just talking about metabolism, I would say that for ages, humans have known that living humans breathe, and when they don't breathe anymore, they're probably not alive. So that's very trivial. But it wasn't until about 100 years ago that people in medicine really discovered how oxygen metabolism works. So there's an analogy to this here. We are normative creatures, and we have been that for millennia, and let's try to find out how it is that it works. There we go. So I would say that this is an eclectic approach to a complex object. Semiotics and cognition are mostly considered separate realms or dimensions that have separate ontologies. Semiotics is about signs and meanings, what I call Popper, philosopher, term the world three, consists of cultural objects, whereas cognition would commonly belong to world two of the mental, and world one is the world of physical objects. In recent years, theories of extended mind as well as cognitive semiotics have blurred the lines concerning what's inside and what is outside. This is basically my abstract. I'm just recapitulating here using inspirations from Michael Tomasello in psychology, John Searle and Clark and Christine Viquier in philosophy, and recent work in the knowledge of sciences. And here I refer especially to the work of Vittorio Gavesi. I'll demonstrate how the normative cognition complex, as I call it, is a unique human capability that fuses the semiotic and the cognitive in the workings of the human perception of normative information. Indeed, this is what makes society possible, I would for instance, John Searle, and so it could be considered to be the dark matter of social life. If it weren't there, the other stuff wouldn't hang together at all. So religious semiotics can maybe be seen as a species of cultural technology where the unseen norms become visible. And I will, perhaps, if time allows, present some empirical examples. Clifford Geertz, he's one of my heroes. And when I was a student, I was very fond of reading Geertz, and I still am. In 1973, he said, cultural acts and the utilization of symbolic forms are social events like any other. They are as public as marriage and as observable as agriculture. It is cultural acts, the utilization of symbolic forms. Geertz was drawing on Suzanne Langer, who was another one of my heroes, who said that the concept of meaning in all its varieties is the dominant philosophical concept of our time. That was in 1962. Sign, symbol, denotation, signification, communication are our intellectual stocks in trade. Now, there is a two-way reference here in the sense that signs and symbols may make the unseen seen or visible. That is, how do we make, for instance, the mental activities in our minds visible and audible? We can make gestures and we can talk. So we're still on the level of the very trivial. But conversely, the visible refers to something mental, intentional, something thought of, dreamt, or imagined. Literature, art, and so forth are very good examples of this, as are religious traditions and practices. The visible can become solidified and objectified, and so shareable and collective, as we know in the concept of triangulation, as I referred to that from philosopher Donald Davis. This gives us a shared reality, like we're in this room. We have shared inner states. This is interesting. Or boring. We can share states, and we can express our states. So we can have shared interpretational formats and shared intentionality. Well, shared intentionality as presented and discussed by a number of contemporary philosophers, among them again, John Searle. So the intentional takes shape, again in Karl Popper's World 3 idea, the world of objective human knowledge and thought that can be objectified. And I here, of course, would like to refer also to Umberto Eco, his work on interpretation and over-interpretation, which I think is a very, very sensible little book that I make some of my students read. The intentio auditoris, of course, the author's intention can be very important. But as much as that can be also the intentio operis, that is the intentions in the work. There are constraints on interpretive liberty. You may say, concerning the Lord's Prayer, that there is a mention of bread, but this is not a recipe for baking. So there are limits and constraints to how we interpret things in the same manner. So shared intentionality requires an interpretive community and at the same time also produces it. It's reciprocal and dialectical relationship. And norms, of course, are social governance tools that drive shared behavior, also mental, in the ways we think. Knowledge of norms depends on many things, for instance, language and other local specificities. As you can see these signs there. Now, if you're driving in an Italian town and you're up to the shop in Italian, you will have a problem turning into that street and trying to figure out what does all this mean, okay? Yes. But there is no doubt about the importance of signs here, okay? Signs tell us what some have in mind, or did have in mind, and how you should behave accordingly. So signs mediate the inside and the outside. In our department at Aarhus University, where I come from, and where I'm sort of the space or the platform I'm speaking for, kind of definition space. We were inspired over the last 20 to 30 years by Saussurean semiotics and Persian semiotics, and fusing the inspirations from Paris with those from Bloomington, Indiana, and Tartu and other places. Okay, so we had a very sort of eclectic approach to semiotics, and the way we see it is that well, there's going to be some truth in all of it, and let's see how we can best use these inspirations and theories, methods, as tools. Well. So what we're doing now, some of us, is combining theories of the extended mind with cognitive semiotics in order to theoretically mediate what is inside and what is outside, and so also mediate between self and other. Paul Ricoeur, as you may remember, some time ago said that the sense of self is culturally constituted and mediated. That is also about concerns with religious traditions as powerful governors of these processes. Culture, as we know, is also a semiotic construct. It's about the production and organization of sign-mediated meaning. That's my definition of culture, along the lines of Grimasa, Uriel, and Gustafsson, for instance. This means that very basic things like food are also social, cultural, and semiotic constructs. For instance, you can debate, as they do sometimes in Spain, what is really a paella. And what counts as better. And you can also organize the meaning of what's more healthy. Now, on the outside in, I take my inspiration mostly from my old self, developmental psychologist, primatologist, comparative psychologist, and a host of other things. He's turned out to be a real Renaissance man, I would say. So it's very interesting to see how he, in his book from 1999, talks about human cognition as something that has cultural origins. The evolutionary perspective on how the inside depends on the shared outside. As he says, language creates new forms of cognitive representations. Linguistic symbols are intersubjective, they're perspectival, and they are socially shared. And so, quote here, but the uniquely human forms of thinking derive from, perhaps even are constituted, I think, by the interactive discourse that takes place through the medium of intersubjective and perspectival linguistic symbols, constructions, and discourse patterns. And similar for the ontogenetic perspectives. I have 4 grandchildren, and they're going through this, consecutively. I was too busy with my own kids to notice anything. Well, with Ludwig Wittgenstein, we can say, and I think he is absolutely right on this, we may say that thinking is essentially the activity of operating with science. Or with Charles Sanders Peirce, we have no power of thinking without science. So when we think, as most of us do, at least some of the time, we operate with science. The inside out, that is, in this case, represented mostly by some current philosophy, by John Searle's ideas as when X counts as Y in context C, we constitute, construct social reality, institutions that have deontic powers and that is social norms, deontic powers, stuff that we should do, we must not do, social norms. The philosopher Andy Clark launched in 1998, along with Rick Chalmers, the ideas of the extended mind, the active role of the environment in driving cognitive processes. You may think of a wristwatch or a notebook or a smart cell phone and so forth. So the active role of the environment in driving cognitive processes. I could not remember all this if I did not have this device in front of me. So Andy Clark's idea is that about mind tools, intentional products, language, the social nature of the individual, when language is not just a communication tool or part of my personality. I may be what I eat, but I also am what I say, in a certain sense. So these cultural, social technologies are part of our own personality. Christina Beccari, philosopher, has some interesting ideas about the grammar of society, and in the book that came out in 2006. Now we're moving to the social realm. I'd like to just quote here from the introduction to the work. I call social norms the grammar of society because, like a collection of linguistic rules that are implicit in the language and define it, social norms are implicit in the operations of a society and make it what it is. Like a grammar, a system of norms specifies what is acceptable and what is not in the social book. And this is the linguistic analogy. It's so sure to the core. And now we're getting closer to the normative cognition complex as a unique human capability that fuses the semiotic out there and the cognitive in here in the workings of the perception of normative information. From slow, explicit learning to drive a car, for instance, to bundling fast automatic actions. You know, when you've been driving a car for some years, you sometimes wonder, how did I get here? You know, I was daydreaming most of the time, and well, I managed to get there and so forth. It's all very automatic, but still rule-bound. It just means how well we can integrate what we learn through the slow processes of the system 2 and how they can combine into the fast, automatic, biologically processed system 1 as we call it. So normative cognition makes society possible, and so it could be considered, again, the dark matter of social life. It is invisible, like the air that allows us to speak. We are some 40 people here. Had we been 40 orangutans, the whole scene would have been different. No one would know how to sit or not friendly and things like that. There would be a lot of jumping. Okay. Notice how much children negotiate rules when they play. These little boys are playing football. They're learning that through, physical activities, joint physical activities. They internalize norms and rules and so forth. They can only do that because they know how to practice. They read the situations and see what they do. So, religious semiotics then may be seen as a species of cultural technology, ritual, the obvious aspects of, where the unseen norms become visible, or when you have tablets, stone tablets. So that we may remember we have extrograms, we can offload stuff from our memory into other, other kinds of media. For instance, if you notice there's the London Underground, a very complex system, and if you didn't have that map, you would never get anywhere. At least not where you want to. And so these things function as cognitive anchors that allow us also to distribute cognitive processes and tasks. Here following Edwin Hutchins, cognition. Cognition is a cultural process, material and conceptual tools that we have for cognition. And he's following here regards to. Now, how is it possible? It's a combination of several factors, for instance. Vittorio Galese's idea of a shared manifold is something he wrote about 15 years ago, and I don't think he really worked on that after this period, which I think is a pity. There's certainly something to it. Well, it was at the time considered something like the roots of empathy and the neural basis of intersubjectivity, which lately has been taken up by Mattia Gallotti, Chris Frith, and myself in some work on what we call the neo in collective intentionality. There is, the point here is how intentionality can be derived from individual minds or collective minds and then stored in objects of all kinds. For instance, in stop signs. There's a stop sign is where the local police or the administration think we want to stop. So the institutions that we can produce through offloading and deriving intentionality, in these institutions, we could say that they consist of rules that have denoted powers. But in order for this to work, the institutions and the contents of them must become visible. So the point is here that institutions talk as to texts and behaviors. This is also the idea of Paul Ricoeur's on what is a text and meaningful action and meaningful behavior as text. And I would like to take that further and say we can say the same thing about institutions. Now, religious semiotics, then, of course, as we know, are dominant in cognitive governance. It's top down. And if you ask me where the top is, it's right up there. So the normative cognition complex, and we're close again, where unseen norms become visible, and they become token articulations of systems that you otherwise don't notice. It's basically a Saussurean project. Traffic signs are tokens of an otherwise invisible norm system, right? Spoken words are tokens of an otherwise invisible law. Traffic laws, yes, they are constructed. Cultural laws are reconstructed. in the sense that if you come as an anthropologist to a remote island and you try to work out how culture, institutions, and laws function in that place, because they do, there are no societies without rules, then they are reconstructed in the work of the analyst, in this case, the anthropologist. Traffic signs express different modalities, sorry, their obligations, their permissions, their prohibitions, and exhortations, and so forth. We see similar modalities in narratology. Following Dolezal, you could say anything deontic, axiological, and epistemic. Others might come up with more, but I think Dolezal is to the point here. And we have, of course, again, the linguistic modalities, and in mind, predictive, subjunctive, imperative, operative, yeser, and so forth. The point, and you can illustrate this with the whole verbs in English, plus their negations, can, could, may, might, must, ought, shall, should, will, and would. This is the normal list of verbs in English. Some languages have many more modalities. That's the point being here that, as far as I know, and I've tried to do some research into this area, that all languages can express these modalities. Now, we use these modalities to think with. How would anyone think about, not only communicate about, such orders without language in mind? So we use language to sort of calibrate the very rough impressions we may have from our dealings with surroundings. You can fine-tune your perceptions and your reactions, maybe help inner speech. Whenever I behave, I signify whether I want it or not. Even madness needs to be interpreted to be madness. So you can also see yourself as another. This is how normative cognition influences and works in metacognitive processes. In the normative matrices, and mostly without us being aware of the facts. If you remember Strauss's ideas about how within themselves in many without their being aware of, it's much more elegant and fresh, and they'll answer while they're ignorant of it. You are not just what you think you are much more. So that's an eclectic approach to a complex art. The idea was to describe how the normative cognition complex can cross the inside-outside divide as immediacy, so semiotically mediated. I have a problem with immediacy. It's an interesting notion, but I think it's semiotically always. Behavioral and mental alignment with normative standards require internalization, learning from schemas, scripts, their valences, etc. We're updating, we're cognitive, running in the background, just like a laptop, doing things that we don't ask it to do. It's updating, running in the background. And we're monitoring internal control loops from headaches to biosemiotics, things going on without our knowing it. I mean, we are very fortunate that we do not notice our brains working. We can't feel their activities. Feedback, externalizing in accordance or non-accordance with the normative rules, and then again confirming, perhaps questioning the system if you wish to disperse it in political practice. But it's only behavioral and mental functioning that's normatively evaluated. It's and finishing line here, it's not just ubiquitous and invisible, but it's also subconscious and correct. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I invite all the panelists to have a look at the plaque over there. It is a plaque that was placed here in 1928 to celebrate the most distinguished scholars that in the various centuries were active at the University of Turin. There's only one theologian, it's Sigismondo of Gerville, who's now completely forgotten, but he was one of the main opponents of Rousseau. But if you go down at medicine and surgery, Medicina and Chirurgia, the second line, 19th century, you come across Cesare Lombroso. And Cesare Lombroso was someone who believed that the face was sort of a character that without any mediation would in a way express the figura of the individual's criminality. So what kind of sign you adopt, whether an immediate conception of the relation between significant perception and signified content, or a mediated perception, of course the consequences can be huge. It was also one of the first to advocate the racist theory in Italy. So, I now open the floor to discussion, and I've seen first Bernard and then Robert.
Is Volker?
I suppose your question is for Volker.
Sorry, the reader. I'd like to seek clarifications from two of our speakers. Let's not get the first. Let's Volker regain his seat and composure. To what extent would it be fair to say that the kind of model that you are proposing is quite compatible with, or maybe a variation of, the basic Chomsky's claim regarding language? Everything has to go between our brain. Our brain has to provide a capacity to generate any cultural objects. But my question is, are you actually saying anything more than that? So do you want, shall I ask the other question as well, or should we take one at a time? What do you prefer?
Probably one at a time.
Okay,
it's going to be clearer.
I'm definitely not saying anything like what Chomsky might have intended to say about, say, language, and language as a brain phenomenon. My original background was in philology, okay, in Oriental languages, and how shall I put it? I can't use the word, but I think, linguistics took a turn from being the study of language to the study of the brain. If you pick up a linguistics book catalog from a publisher, very often you will see, the front page illustrated with synapses and then things like that. No, I'm definitely not talking about any kind of module in the brain. On the contrary, I would say that yes, there has to be a processor, and when I die, my thinking will probably go away. But until then, I will say that, okay, if I'm a believer, then I'm a firm believer in Wittgenstein's ideas about our thinking as operating with science. And that means that we don't have any thoughts worth talking about until we have some kind of representational system and we are able to communicate. The point being that, of course, you can have impressions and sensations as a pre-linguistic child, okay? But it's only when you have the linguistic competence that you will know that what makes you cry or have a pleasant feeling is actually a toothache.
So I would say that I'm trying to say something that is absolutely in opposition to Chomsky's ideas.
The question to Oka is for clarification of your concept of attribution. Because you started off by saying religion is not a substantial entity, but a result of attribution. And I thought I can buy into that, but that is a general feature of the semiotic system. But later in the analysis, and certainly in your conclusions, attribution didn't figure at all. I mean, this is one of the axioms that you started with, or that you said but it didn't mention. You didn't mention it. And when you have a statement like a religious sign consists of the distinction between immanence and transcendence, I have to ask what status you are attaching to immanence and transcendence. Are they too functions of attribution, or are you implying some sort of ontological status for them?
Yeah, thanks for the question. As to the first question of attribution, as you might have noticed, I refer to the empirical material as propositions in a Indo-European SBO order, subject, predicate, object, and position the subject and the object, or the nouns at the semiotic positions. Predicate is the way of attribution in between. It's the relation. We always have to combine, entities with processes. It's like in physics. So is it matter or energy? It's both. It oscillates. And like the logical function x is a p. This is attribution. And to the second, it's both. It's a logical, structural feature of religion, transcendent immanence, and the semantic and syntactic as well. I refer to the very formal distinction between transcendence and immanence in this modality of English translations. Theory of model or mode. Simply immanence is that what social communication thinks of it to be known, familiar, conventional, true, whatever. Whereas transcendence is the unknown in a very formal sense. The things we are not familiar with yet, which has to gain evidence, which has to get familiar with.
See Robert first, and Patrick, and Jensen.
Yeah, thank you for these excellent presentations. And for me, all of them actually raised the same problem that I'm struggling with, and I hope you can help me resolve it, although I fear it may be too big. Which is the question of whether religion is natural or not, and whether semiotics is a science or something else. And each of you seem to me to present religion, religious experience, religious interaction as a natural extension of semiotic processes. Clearest in the case of Yeppe's paper, but also the way that Foucault shows that mystical experience of Mechtild is an extension of the Persian understanding of semiosis. And even in Professor Marmot's paper, interestingly, where the discussion surrounded how, in the context of explaining the Eucharist, certain truths about how signs just work were revealed in the course of these debates, thus anticipating aspects of modern semiotics. So for me, what this raises is this really large question of whether religion as a mode of semiosis should just be understood as an extension, natural, as it were, of other semiotic processes. Now, the dilemma is this. The dilemma is that the presentation of this, of religion understood in these semiotic terms as natural doesn't answer the problem that, of course, it's not natural in the sense that it's not inevitable, for example, to accept that the Eucharist is both figurative and real. As I indicated yesterday by quoting John Tolland's rejection of all figurative forms of interpretation. And also we can have easily a rejection of the reality of mystical experience. So it's natural except when it's not. And I'm therefore struggling with, and of course there are also ideological and cultural dimensions to this too. So as Professor Marmo mentioned in his talk, this figurative interpretation of the Eucharist emerged also out of older Christian models of typology, which were specifically developed to accommodate the Old Testament, so-called, to the New Testament, in which the Old Testament was understood as figurative and as foreshadowing, right, in the sense of umbra, foreshadowing the truth that was revealed in the gospel. So in this case, to convert the Old Testament text into a sign was to make it into something less than reality. The reality that Christians saw as revealed fully in the Gospels. And then Tolland makes the further step I showed yesterday of just getting rid of the sign. He says you don't need it anymore. It's a ladder to heaven. Once you're in heaven, you've got the Gospels. It's all plain. You don't need it. So semiosis is not just natural, but it's also cultural, and it's a form of ideology even, and ideological violence, as in the case of Christian typology. And so it raises the struggle for me about how we negotiate this tension, about first how we understand religion, whether this is something that is natural or rather parasitic upon natural, in some sense, semiotic processes. And secondly, how it is that we conceive what we do as semioticians or semioticians of religion. Are we engaged in science? And can we reduce it to diagrams and math? Or are we also doing cultural studies? Are we doing historical studies, right? And is it necessary to nuance our theoretical and structural models by accommodating these very different kinds of cultural approaches? So.
I'll just say something about that, because I think medieval theologians try to cope with this kind of questions when they try to figure out, in the 13th century especially, how sacraments work, because they are instituted by God. And so what's the difference between natural semiotics or sacramental science or sacramental semiotics? So they came up with different theories, of course, but all of them, one of them especially, the one proposed by, especially by the Franciscans, underlined the fact that sacraments work on the basis of a convention, of a negotiation, of a pact between God and man. And so they are not natural. So they are somehow cultural. Only Dominicans try to deal with them as natural science, because they are, and so they figured out how through the sacramental formulas things or could change, like in the Eucharist, but also in other. The character that's interesting became an inner quality. So starting from being something exterior and so visible, it became something that only angels could see, because it's a mark derived from baptism. So there's a very interesting book on this kind of debates written by Raymond Katash, Modificas, which I suggest you to read if you are interested.
Patrick?
Yes, I have a question for Patrick. In your semiotic analysis of the phrase of nature remarkable, you turn it into a complex Persian sign and appropriate poetic system, but basically it's a formal analysis for positional content of the phrase. So my question is then, how does your model deal with, actual linguistic interaction? For example, the way you have used it actually as a three-quarter speech. So that doesn't make a religious sign wrong. Somebody might just quote the phrase in a chaotic manner. So basically, it is not really the formal analysis of propositional content that is decisive for the status of a religious sign, however defined. Right? But it's the ongoing pragmatics of interaction that go far beyond propositional content. Participant roles, contextualization, co-occurrence with non-linguistic signs, and all that kind of stuff. How would your model accommodate?
Yeah, thanks for this question. So certainly it was under complex. However, I wouldn't say to reduce it, but also to extend it to diagram. Formalization is not only reduction. So it's also. You're totally right. However, it depends on how you conceptualize communication. The utterance aspect. I would consider it being in the sign and text are, they have to be performed for sure. I could say they are performed in my talk, so in a scientific perspective. I don't have a direct, approach to we only have empiricism, we don't have the phenomena. So I would, or I actually do treat text also as informed communication. However, texts are not isolated. They are written in a certain context. I don't refer to the author's intentions. So neither necessarily to the readers in this business. However, text always has a context like the system has of environment. So it's for sure it's important to consider the context and to consider the other semiotic layers of performance, like phonetics, like atmosphere. You talked about, so this is certainly under complex, but it's a starting point to take text as a reference medium. So literal text and the texture of communication. From there on to extend it to non-verbal linguistic semantic layers.
I was thinking about Robert's question. It was almost a lecture, right? And you raised so many fundamental questions. And I said that one of them, like, what is religion? I actually published a book with exactly that title. It came out a couple of years ago on Routledge, and it's now being translated into Italian. That's another story. Where I try to answer that question by pointing to something that I didn't mention here, because it's another aspect of the normative cognition complex. It's moral psychology. And I think that religious systems, I have been teaching comparative religion for a good 30 years, and I have taught I don't know what, okay? So it's my impression that the kind of moral psychology that has come into being over the past, say, 10, 15 years, with a lot of experimental, developmental, psychological, work, just to mention Jonathan Haidt and Craig Joseph, and a few other people, Senator Armstrong, and so forth. I think religion basically rides piggyback on moral psychology. I have not yet found any religious system anywhere that does not somehow fit into the models that have been produced by these psychologists, and I find it extremely interesting. Then, of course, on top of the sort of individual proclivities or dispositions come semiosis, so as to make this these intuitive dispositions cooperate, and it's through the use of sciences, from the individual, biological, psychological, to the social and cultural. So I think that's what I was trying to display here, that the inseparable merger of these dimensions. So I mean, we can of course distinguish analytically between the different layers and mechanisms and so forth, but in reality, it's just going on all the time, as if there should be a special quality or character of religious communication. I would say one of the basic things I think we mentioned during Jacobson is that there is a confusion between autonomy and metaphor. So what is metaphor? It's taken to be metonymical. And that, of course, is a very basic, not just linguistic, but also cognitive function. When you say sugar, you think there's sugar in the box, right? So yeah. So I would say that religion is probably, besides being something that proceeds or builds on moral psychological dispositions, is also a mistake.
That's all?
Yes, that's it. I was wondering, can we compare the notion of figura in Pascalius with the Hemsted notion of linguistic figure from semantics? Or is it actually the opposite? Just a clarification.
Actually, you promised to go back to figura. That's a big difference.
Well, I don't think we have the same, at least. It's if we take the figure of expression, then maybe we have the same. Even if really don't, because the expression plane figures are not signs at all. Okay? So for Pascalius, I think figure or character are signs. So, but they are signs as far as they are written, signs of elementary law, process of sounds. So it's well, I don't find the same kind of the naive idea of Pascalius that no grammarian at that time was really supporting is that there's a one-to-one relationship between written signs and vocal sounds. Because they knew very well that in Latin, at least, this was the paradigmatic example, there might be differences or signs that can be read in two ways, or vice versa, sounds that can be signified by different written marks. So it's nobody was so straight to support this idea. So it was an interpretation of the grammatical theory that he proposed, and the thing that was surprising to me, for me to discover, is that it was using polysemy, was dwelling on a polysemy of the term figura, sometimes using it in a typological way, and sometimes, in this case, as in grammatical sense. So it's, since nobody really understood this point, it was important for me to show that this is exactly a way of indicating the immediacy of the possible experience of the sacrament of Eucharist, because many examples that Pascasius quotes in his treatise are just meant to show that if we were not so possibly horrified by the experience of eating Christ's body, we would just do that. So it's the species of bread and wine are kept there just to protect us from this horrifying experience. So it's very clear about that.
Any more?
I would like to, if I may, to react on Robert's crucial question. As to the first question, is religion nature? Because we know that the distinction between nature and culture is a social distinction, and so is based on the context in which we use the distinction. In science, to answer your second question, I would say for sure, religion is all about matter. It doesn't fall from the sky to ride a mouse, a famous expression. It doesn't stem from heaven, nor does it come out of the Platonic cave. It's here, and it deals with matter and other things. However, in a different way than other social forms of communication too. We have to treat it, I would say, scientifically, against, sorry for the hermeneutics of too much subjectivity. I work together with colleagues in area studies and so on. They say, oh well, you read it like in your way, I read it in mine. This is not, a scientific way. I would like to force us to more, methodological objectification, to regulation, not, substantiality and so on. But that we get more clear than we are usually in hermeneutics and what we call interpretation, to formalize the science, the structural science, information, communication, Kubernetes, systems, semiotics. These are all structural sciences, which, by the way, not only help us in what we call the humanities, help us, but may open up perspectives of a unification of science, because natural sciences and engineering also relate to the structural science. From an evolutionary perspective, I would say that religion is extremely improbable. Like language, the emergence of language and life itself, it's very, very improbable. The same was true with religion.
We will gather two last questions from Webb and Tom.
I want to return to Robert's, one of Robert's points that I still feel, and it's maybe me, that I still feel utterly unclear about it. This is a question that really posed to Jeppe and Volkart both, which is that you both give us accounts of cognition, semiosis, and semiotic cognition, cognitive semiosis, and so forth, in which your account of religion seems part and parcel with your account of your respective larger topic, or smaller topic. Your respective topic, that is to say, cognition and semiosis, in such a way that what makes something religious seems to me, I'm still just confused as to where semiosis, what's the difference? Let me put it in very vulgar terms, say, for Volkart, what's the difference, for another, what's the difference between your account of religion and your account of cognition or semiosis? they seem to be, they seem to become isomorphic in ways that the possibility that there might be something distinctive about religious semiosis seems to begin to, I find it very hard to pin down.
One more question about sacrament. The anthropologist R.R. Merritt defined sacrament as the consecration or elevation or sanctification of the natural process. He wrote that in a book in the 30s called The Sacraments of Simple Folk. We don't talk like that anymore. But he was trying to make a definition of sacrament that would be generalizable and comparative across traditions, including the sacraments of indigenous peoples, say, today. So how would you address a definition like that? The elevation, in the case of the Eucharist, it would be the natural process is eating, right? And it's the sanctification of that natural process and placing it and giving it a special place. Is there any way that a definition like that can speak to the specific formulation of what a sacrament is in the context that you're thinking?
Like those who have that 3 times statements in the order of presentation.
It's true that sacraments in this context are rights of that gives or a different meaning to our ordinary acts. I think that at least from Pascal's on, something more is ascribed to the sacraments in the Christian theology, medieval Christian theology. I mean, the words, especially the importance is given to the words of the formulas that are bringing or out something more than mere sanctification or ritualization of just a meaning, an intellectual meaning. Because there's something efficacious, productive, I would say, productive in these words, in these formulas, productive of physical effects. So they are more akin to magical formulas, I would say, without being too blunt. But because the thing is exactly that both the water that is used in baptism, in the act of washing people, is effective of physical and spiritual effects on the baptized. So it is not only the washing of the physical body that counts, the washing of something else, and also the impression of an effect, a spiritual effect, which later on will be called. In the case of Eucharist, the transformation, there's a physical transformation, there's a recreation bring about by God himself. And so that's why in the 13th century, Franciscans proposed to interpret that as a convention, as a pact between man and God, who is engaged in a system with the priest or the one who performs and says and pronounces the formula assisting him in producing this effect. So it's something more than just the simplification or the reframing of everyday action.
Yeah, thanks for the question. The relation between semiotics, systems theory, and cognition on the one hand and religion on the other is somehow semiotics. I use semiotics and systems theory as a tool, as a paradigmatic approach to understand religion as a subject. So every religious process is semiosis, and that's paradigmatic approach, but not the other way around, that every semiosis is religious. However, behind your question, I think there lies a crucial question, how to understand transcendence, because somehow transcendence in a formal sense is a basic feature of every sign. Every sign has the nature of transcending itself. That leads me to the confessional task of what to understand what is religion. My very, in 1:30, my answer, less than 30 seconds, religion deals with contingency as a social fact. What is in me? How do I understand your smile? Is it laughing at me or is it making fun of me? Whatever. So basic social contingency in an ultimate way. We have insurance companies to deal with contingency and but in an ultimate way by using the distinction between transcendence and religion. So the both defining elements need each other to get to lead to a definition of religion. Not the coping with contingency is per se religious, and not the transcendence immanence distinction is per se religious, but the combination. This would be my argument. And regarding cognition, although it's a question for Jeppe, I would say, well, it's not against Jeppe, but usually in cognitive science systems, so we have too much brain symptoms. Like the physicists, talk to the biologists and say, oh, in the end you will know it's all atomic. Molecular, it's fine, it's all atomic. And we don't understand life. My argument in this way, in the atomistic way, my argument is, if we take the social realm, social cultural reality, as a pure aggregation of mental processes, we don't understand the Eigenstruktur, the Eigenlogik of social cultural reality. It's more, and thanks to whomever, less than a mental process. So the categorical distinction between mental process on the one hand and social communication there is crucial, and the interface, then the interaction, then is very interesting. So cognition is not only a mental process, and with Popper I would say it's the other way around. It's world 3 comes first, meaning, then world 2 mental, and finally world 1 physics, like Peirce argues that we have to understand the relation between the representation, one, personalness, and object secondness with thirdness. So it's all about thirdness, and then the downward causation to world 2.
1 minute for the last word.
Well, I would say down to the basics. I think religion is about imagination. If you had no imagination, you could not have religion. The thing then is that it's not enough to have individual imagination. You need to imagine in common, together. And my point being that, well, if you met Jesus, you wouldn't know that you had met Jesus if you had not heard of him, right? So there is the semiosis and the semiotics and the cultural systems that sort of mediate between our individual imaginations and what we then construct in communal, social, cultural, together. And these ideas can solidify and become the 10 Commandments and or the Quran and or whatever it is. But if you could not imagine, you could not read or think or behave. according to any of these religious
Included invention, there is no heaven.
Precisely.
Well, let's thank this extraordinary panel. It's scheduled for lunch.